So, today I want to talk to you about how it is that we can do research of a scientific kind for something as complex as human behavior, as opposed to things that are simple like quantum physics or chemical analysis or biological exploration through a microscope. People are simply more complex than pretty much anything I can think of. And to do research on them, to understand how a human mind works, how a brain works, how society functions, and how relationships function, is complex and a challenging story. And the story of clever hands just goes to demonstrate that if animals are that complicated, then just imagine how complicated people are. So the usual thing is to run an experiment. You have a group of participants that volunteer and agree to the ethical codes that scientists must abide by, and then we can draw some conclusions based upon the experiments that those participants engage in. And there's a lot of dramatic stories. There's case studies, single stories, just like Clever Hands. And there's a lot of big discoveries that have taken place in various ways, and we'll really explore a lot of that within this course. Now, what we do is start off with a hypothesis. And from there, we have an educated guess, and we try to make a decision. So I'm going to talk to you today about research in psychology, and a funny thing about psychology, and I'll come back to that, is that, everybody really wants to be an amateur psychologist. Everybody wants to be an observer of people. And we live in a world where there's people like Dr. Phil and radio hosts and all sorts of people that use the fact that most people don't understand people to make themselves appear more intelligent. And the fact is, even psychologists are not mind readers, but we do experiments in order to discover the likelihood of certain things occurring. Now, here's a kind of sentence from a publication that just drives psychologists crazy. Almost half of children of divorces enter adult as worried, underachieving, self-deprecating, and sometimes angry young men and women. And that sounds like a psychological study of some kind, right? That somebody wants to argue about the importance of divorce and breakdown of the family. So just think about it for a moment. Almost half of children of divorce enter adulthood as worried. Well, worried about what? Worried about crime in your community? Worried about whether or not you're going to have a job when you graduate from college? Worried about who you're going to find to be in a relationship? Worried about foreign wars? Worried about the economy? Worried about COVID-19? Worried about your health? Of course people are worried. So the fact that that statement doesn't tell you or make a clear connection between worry and divorce is very misleading. And so it's very important for us to ensure that we always look at statements with a critical eye. Now, here's another thing. It says they're underachieving. Well, underachieving compared to what? Compared to what someone says? There's no evidence in this statement that somebody can prove that someone is underachieving scientifically. It's just a statement in order to move the emotion along, to move the mythic level. Self-deprecating? Well, sometimes I think that It's actually kind of nice for a person to be modest. It's not bad to be modest and to self-deprecate on occasion, especially if it's an accurate perspective of yourself. Now, pathological self-deprecation, that's a completely different story, but that headline doesn't say anything about that. And they're angry young men and women. Well, have you been angry in the last year? Societies break down, relationships break down. We have disappointments in life. That doesn't mean it was caused necessarily by divorce. Even when there's a correlation, that does not mean causation. And that's what I want us to think about today is, how do you know what is true? How do you know what is accurate? How do you know what the answer is? Yes, clever Hans was smart, but that the message that was given, that he could read and write German, that he could do math and all those things, were not true. The same thing with what we know to be true. We know to be true things 99% of the time because either we hear them all the time or someone in authority tells us. But as university students, it's important for us to analyze what is true. Our parents told us what was true. Our teachers told us what was true. Our textbooks tell us what is true. But we need to always look behind that statement of truth to see whether or not it is correct. The role of science, and particularly the scientific study of psychology, is to continually refine, to hold on what holds up, and to let fall away what does not hold up to the evidence. So there are things like repetition or tenacity. You hear something often enough and people tend to believe it. A priori, what's reasonable? You think things through just by thought, what's possible, rational, and so on. And then we have scientific analysis, where we have a hypothesis and we test that hypothesis with various experiments and see where the numbers lead us. What we're always trying to do is disprove the null hypothesis statistically. In psychology, it's next to impossible to prove something to be true, and so what we do is we prove that something is untrue or likely untrue, statistically likely untrue. And in so doing, then we can accept the reasonable alternative hypothesis. So we're always trying to disprove the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis within statistical, quantitative, experimental research within psychology. So what makes something an experiment? Well, you need to start off with two things conceptually. The first is the dependent variable, what you measure, the outcome, and the independent variable, what you vary. And once you have those things in an experiment, you kind of are on your way to having an experiment, at least in the broad sense of the word. So in psychology, it took a long time to figure this out. It wasn't until the 1800s that people had kind of an approach to doing experiments in psychology and figuring out, for example, how to use the simple measurement of time to measure how long a mental operation lasts in your mind. So, pretty cool way to start. Wilhelm Wundt, one of the big figures in experimental psychology, set up the first laboratory in psychology. And he did the following test of mental chronometry. What he simply did was he measured how long it takes to do something. So he would show you a light, and you'd simply press the button. And that would take about 1/5 of a second. And then he would say, instead, you do this. If the light turns on and it's red, you push one button. And if it's green, you push another. So his idea was the motor system to push the button is about the same. The time to observe the light is about the same. But the difference between these two is how long it takes to make a choice. How long it takes to make a choice is what he was looking at. And that difference, when he subtracts them, took about 1/10 of the time by that measurement. So all of a sudden, he could start to measure in an objective sense how long a mental operation takes in your mind. Then psychology went in a lot of different directions, and a famous direction comes from Tickner, who worked with Wundt and developed a psychology department at Cornell. And he was interested in introspection, looking inside of yourself to think very carefully. And when you think about a topic, how do you think about it? That's what he was interested in. And so from a scientific method, that seemed to lose its way. There was nothing testable there. It was a private process. Introspection is a private process. And while there's a lot of introspection in various types of psychological research, for the purposes of this class, we're going to continue to focus on psychology as a science, and a quantitative experimental science specifically, because a lot of the growth that took place in the early part of the 20th century was in response to some of the loosey-goosey introspection that was taking place within psychology. And one of the famous researchers that came along in response to this loosey-goosey introspection was a fellow by the name of John B. Watson, who was known as the father of behaviorism. And he said the mind is unobservable. So we can only study behavior, things that people do. Remember, the mythic level is the subjective level. The phenomena are behaviors. Those are the things that we can study. And then we take those behaviors and bring them back to our mythic level and rewrite our mythic stories about how we understand people. And so we can only study behavior, things that people do, actions that people take, how their mouth moves, when they press a button with their hand, that sort of thing. And then we identify as well the environmental influences on behavior. So we start to look at what are the things that influence animal and human behavior. How do we respond to stimuli within the environment? And we can do this by using a stimulus. And you can control a stimulus as a scientist. And then there's a response. And you can measure that response. And that is how psychology as an experimental science really started to grow. Now, so behaviorism became a very strong part of what psychology was up until about the 1980s. And then there became a cognitive revolution. And again, there seemed to be a bit of a struggle between the scientific side of cognition and the introspective side of cognition. But fortunately, we were starting to learn new ways of measuring brain function and having different machines and tools to be able to measured the electrical flow, for example, within the brain, and then we were able to see objective representations of what was going on within a person's mind. And that was enabling us to move cognitive psychology in a wonderfully scientific direction. Now, if you remember Clever Hands, there was a correlation between people asking him questions and him giving the answers. But the correlation does not denote causation. One doesn't cause the other. Just like divorce does not necessarily be the only cause of bitterness and lack of success in children later in life. Causation must be determined through rigorous experiments. And in those experiments, there needs to be a time-order relationship, there needs to be an elimination of other causal factors, and there needs to be a clear delineation between the cause and the effect. So, for example, if I say 100% of people that are in jail for murder eat bread. Therefore, bread causes murder. Well, obviously that's wrong. There are lots of other factors that you can look at, and when you start to parse things out, you see that eating bread is just an extraneous variable.